You know, there's something deeply powerful about a person who feels everything. An empath doesn't just walk into a room, they absorb it. They sense the tension, the unspoken words, the fear behind the smile. And for a long time, that sensitivity feels like both a blessing and a curse. Because when an empath meets someone avoidant, someone who fears closeness, who uses silence as control, who keeps love just far enough to make you chase it, that empathy becomes a trap. You start believing that if you just love harder, understand deeper, or stay longer, you can heal them. But that's the illusion, the hook that keeps you stuck. The avoidant feeds on inconsistency. They give you just enough affection to keep you hoping, but not enough to feel safe. They disappear when you need closeness, then reappear when you finally start to pull away. And you, the super empath, interpret their confusion as pain, their distance as fear, their silence as depth. Because you see potential instead of patterns, but here's where the story changes. One day, the super empath realizes something. Their empathy is not a gift meant to be drained, it's meant to be directed. That the ability to understand others is powerful, but only when it's balanced with understanding yourself. You stop trying to decode mixed signals because real love doesn't come in riddles. You stop over-explaining your worth to people who prefer to misunderstand you. And you realize that the calm that follows walking away is not loneliness, it's peace. That's when the manipulation ends, not because the avoidant changed, but because you did. You no longer chase closure. You no longer respond to emotional breadcrumbs. You begin to see that your empathy, when paired with boundaries, becomes wisdom. And wisdom says, I can love you, but I will not lose myself doing it. That is how the super empath wins. Not through revenge, not through silence, but through self-respect so unwavering that even manipulation cannot reach it. Because the moment you stop trying to save someone from their avoidance, you save yourself from your own abandonment. And that is when you finally meet the love you were always trying to give away. Empathy is one of the most beautiful gifts a person can have. It allows you to see the world through another's eyes, to sense emotions without words, to connect on levels that logic can't touch. But the same heart that feels deeply can also be the one that bleeds the most when boundaries are missing. When you care so much that you forget to protect yourself, empathy turns from a strength into a slow form of self-destruction. You start to mistake endurance for love and self-sacrifice for compassion. You absorb their moods, their fears, and even their emotional neglect, believing that understanding them will somehow heal the relationship. An empath often believes that the more they give, the more love will flow in return. So they stretch their emotional limits, forgiving things they shouldn't, staying longer than they planned, explaining themselves to people who have already decided not to listen. When the other person withdraws, they rush to fill the silence with reassurance. When the other becomes cold, they become warmer. This imbalance becomes a cycle, one person overgiving, the other undergiving until the empath begins to run on emotional fumes. The desire to fix or comfort someone who refuses to meet them halfway drains their self-esteem piece by piece. What makes it more painful is that empaths often believe they're being kind by enduring it. They think, if I can just love them enough, they'll feel safe enough to love me back. But this belief gives the manipulative or emotionally unavailable partner silent permission to continue. They sense the empath's fear of loss, their hunger for connection, and they use it to maintain control. The empath becomes so focused on preserving the bond that they ignore the cost to their own well-being. Their empathy, instead of being a light, becomes the leash that holds them in place. Real empathy doesn't require self-abandonment. It's not about shrinking yourself to make someone else comfortable. It's about being able to say, I see your pain, but I won't let it drown me. When empathy lacks boundaries, it becomes martyrdom. You lose touch with your needs, your joy, and even your identity. You begin to live reactively, constantly adjusting your energy based on someone else's moods. You start to feel anxious, exhausted, and unsure of where your emotions end and theirs begin. The truth is, empathy needs structure to stay pure. You can understand someone's trauma without excusing their toxic behavior. You can care about their healing without making it your responsibility. The moment you set that internal line, when you decide that your peace matters just as much as their pain, you reclaim your power. Empathy without boundaries gives away that power. Empathy with boundaries becomes wisdom. It allows you to love deeply without losing yourself in the process, to give compassion without becoming a casualty of it. And when you learn that balance, your empathy no longer destroys you, it protects you. An avoidant person thrives on emotional distance. They are most comfortable when they feel in control, when intimacy is close enough to taste but never quite within reach. They pull away to maintain that illusion of independence, not realizing that what they are really doing is manipulating connection through inconsistency. Their greatest power is not in what they say or do, but in how you respond to their absence, their silence, and their withdrawal. The moment you start to chase, explain, or justify, you step into the dance they've designed, one where you are always reaching, and they are always retreating. Avoidant manipulation doesn't usually look loud or aggressive. It's subtle, quiet, and often masked as confusion or busyness. They disappear right after moments of closeness, creating a wave of anxiety that pushes you to seek reassurance. When you call them out, they might say, "I just need space," or "You're overreacting." The empath, craving connection and fearing disconnection, interprets these moments as something to fix rather than something to recognize. They begin to question their own perceptions. They start to think, "Maybe I'm too much," or "Maybe I scared them away." That self-doubt is exactly how the avoidant keeps control, by making you doubt yourself more than you doubt them. What the empath doesn't realize at first is that the avoidant's power depends entirely on their reaction. Every time you chase, every time you beg for communication, every time you explain your worth, you reinforce the avoidant's belief that they can dictate the rhythm of the relationship. They learn that withholding affection keeps you hooked, that unpredictability keeps you craving stability, and that emotional distance keeps you chasing closeness. It's not always malicious, sometimes it's subconscious, but the effect is the same. You are trapped in an emotional cycle that feeds their control and starves your peace. When you finally stop reacting, the dynamic begins to shift. The silence they once used to punish you becomes their own discomfort. Your calm becomes unsettling to them because they can no longer predict your response. When you stop over-explaining and start observing, you reclaim your emotional footing. The avoidant loses their grip not through confrontation, but through your detachment. You begin to see that their behavior isn't a reflection of your worth, but of their fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control. By not reacting, you take away the fuel that drives their pattern. You stop feeding the cycle of withdrawal and pursuit. You begin to understand that real connection doesn't require you to chase or beg, it requires mutual effort. The avoidant may try to re-engage once they sense your emotional distance, offering crumbs of affection to pull you back in. But by then, you've learned the truth. Attention given out of guilt or manipulation is not love. The moment you recognize that their tactics no longer work, your silence becomes strength, your detachment becomes clarity, and your calm becomes the boundary that breaks their control. Emotional breadcrumbs are one of the most deceptive forms of manipulation in relationships. They are those small, fleeting gestures of affection, a late night text after days of silence, a sudden compliment when you've been feeling neglected, a promise of change that never materializes. These moments create a surge of hope, convincing you that things are finally shifting, that the person who's been distant still cares. But what's really happening is not love being renewed, it's control being maintained. The avoidant or manipulative partner knows just how much to give to keep you invested without ever offering the consistency that true love requires. For the empath, these breadcrumbs feel intoxicating because they confirm what they've been longing to believe, that their patience, their love, and their emotional labor are finally being recognized. That small text, that brief apology, that one good day together feels like proof that their efforts are working. But in reality, these crumbs are strategically timed. They arrive when you're about to give up, when you're ready to walk away, or when your silence begins to threaten the avoidance sense of control. It's not affection, it's maintenance just enough to reset your emotional hope without addressing the real problem. The cruel part is that breadcrumbs create an emotional roller coaster. You swing between joy and despair, between closeness and distance, between hope and disappointment. This unpredictability creates an addictive loop in the brain, similar to gambling. You never know when the next reward will come, so you stay, waiting for another hit of connection. You tell yourself, maybe this time it's real, even though the pattern keeps repeating. You start to measure love in moments instead of consistency, in gestures instead of growth. And without realizing it, you lower your standards not because you want to, but because you've been conditioned to see scarcity as value. The truth is, real love doesn't come in fragments. It doesn't make you beg for crumbs when you deserve the whole meal. When someone truly cares, their effort is consistent, their communication is clear, and their presence doesn't depend on your ability to tolerate neglect. Love that requires you to constantly interpret mixed signals isn't love, it's confusion packaged as passion. And the longer you accept breadcrumbs, the more they train you to believe that's all you're worthy of. Breaking this cycle begins the moment you stop mistaking crumbs for care. You start noticing patterns instead of promises. You realize that love shouldn't be unpredictable, that affection shouldn't have to be earned, and that peace is more valuable than the temporary thrill of being noticed. The moment you stop responding to inconsistent affection, the manipulator loses their leverage. They can no longer pull you back in with minimal effort because you now recognize the game. And when you finally demand emotional consistency, not through begging, but through silence and self-respect, the dynamic collapses. The breadcrumbs stop, and so does your hunger for them, because you've remembered that you were never starving for love, only for the consistency you kept giving to the wrong person. Boundaries are not walls that keep love out. They are the framework that allows love to exist without self-destruction. For a super empath, boundaries are often the hardest lesson to learn because their natural instinct is to give, to heal, and to understand. They are drawn to the emotional wounds of others and believe that compassion can fix what distance has broken. But without boundaries, empathy turns into servitude. It stops being a gift and becomes a burden, one that slowly erodes your sense of identity. The transformation begins when an empath realizes that love and self-respect are not opposing forces, they are inseparable. You can care deeply about someone and still refuse to be mistreated by them. When a super empath learns to say no, it's not rejection, it's self-preservation. Boundaries teach others how to treat you, but more importantly, they remind you how to treat yourself. Saying no to emotional manipulation, inconsistency, or neglect doesn't mean you've stopped loving. It means you've started loving wisely. You stop confusing suffering with loyalty. You stop apologizing for your needs. You stop interpreting someone's withdrawal as a challenge to prove your worth. Boundaries redefine the emotional equation. Instead of pouring energy into fixing others, you begin investing that energy into protecting your peace. This shift is powerful because it changes the dynamic completely. Manipulators and avoidants thrive in the absence of boundaries. They test limits not because they are brave, but because they are afraid of accountability. When you have no boundaries, you make it easy for them to control the rhythm of the relationship, deciding when to be close, when to be cold, and when to reappear. But when you start setting limits, when you no longer respond instantly, when you stop explaining yourself repeatedly, when you don't react to emotional withdrawal, their strategy stops working. You're no longer predictable, and that unpredictability takes back your power. Boundaries are not punishments, they are filters. They separate those who value your presence from those who exploit it. They protect your empathy from being weaponized against you. Every time you say, "This doesn't feel right to me," or "I won't tolerate this behavior," you're not being difficult, you're being clear. That clarity becomes magnetic because self-respect commands the kind of love that thrives on mutual effort. People who truly care will respect your boundaries because they see your worth. Those who only sought control will fade because their power ends where your boundaries begin. For a long time, the super empath believes that love means enduring everything. But as they grow wiser, they learn that love without boundaries is not love, it's dependency. Boundaries don't limit love, they elevate it. They allow empathy to breathe without suffocating, to connect without collapsing, to give without losing. When you master the art of boundaries, your empathy stops being reactive and starts being selective. And in that moment, you realize that saying no to what drains you is the most compassionate act of self-love you can ever perform. Peace is the quiet victory that comes after years of emotional chaos, the kind of victory that doesn't need to be announced or proven. For the super empath who has endured manipulation, withdrawal, and inconsistency, the idea of peace once felt distant, something that existed only after the other person changed or finally saw their worth. But peace doesn't come from being understood by the one who hurt you. It comes from understanding yourself so deeply that their approval no longer matters. The avoidance manipulation loses all its strength the moment you stop seeking closure from them. You realize that you don't need an apology to heal. You don't need validation to move forward. The absence of their chaos becomes the space where you finally find yourself again. For so long, the empath equates victory with change. If they can just make the other person love better, show up, or communicate, that would mean they've won. But real victory doesn't come from getting them to stay. It comes from learning to let go with grace. It's not about outsmarting them or showing how much stronger you are. It's about reaching that moment of clarity where you recognize that their inability to love you properly was never your failure. It was their limitation. Once you stop trying to fix what broke you, you begin to reclaim the energy you once gave away trying to be enough. Peace is not passive, it's an active choice. It's waking up and deciding that your mind will no longer be a battlefield. It's refusing to chase mixed signals or decode silence. It's the deep exhale that comes when you no longer need to prove your worth to someone incapable of seeing it. That's the true win, not revenge, not recognition, but the serenity of self-respect. The avoidant loses their control because they can no longer trigger your emotional response. They can no longer draw you into the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. Your calm becomes unsettling to them because they relied on your reactions to feel powerful. When that reaction ends, so does the manipulation. The empath's peace is built on truth, the truth that love should never feel like anxiety, that caring for someone should not mean abandoning yourself, and that closure doesn't come from another person's explanation, but from your own decision to stop participating in your pain. When you no longer feel the need to win the argument or be chosen, you are already free. The victory is in walking away without bitterness, in knowing that silence can heal more than confrontation ever could. When you reach this level of inner calm, you no longer crave what once hurt you. You no longer measure love in how hard you have to fight for it. Instead, you begin to attract relationships that feel safe, easy, and mutual. You find contentment not in being needed, but in being at peace. That's when you realize that the greatest act of self-love isn't proving your value to anyone, it's living in such a way that your peace can never be taken from you again. In the end, the journey of the super empath is not about winning against the avoidant, but about reclaiming peace, power, and self-worth. It's the quiet realization that love should never cost your sanity, that empathy without boundaries isn't kindness but self-neglect, and that the greatest strength lies in walking away from what diminishes you. True healing begins when you stop chasing closure and start choosing yourself. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for honoring the strength it takes to turn pain into wisdom. May you always protect your peace and never forget the power of your own heart.